I don't know the narratives she's sharing with others now. Maybe she's portraying me as someone who had a breakdown or who ran away from responsibilities. Perhaps she's depicting herself as the heartbroken wife left without explanation. Whatever version of events she's crafting, I'm certain it casts her in a favorable light. But here's the truth. My departure wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a result of seeing things clearly. I spent years believing I had a solid marriage filled with routines, shared jokes, and cherished memories spanning a decade. I was the reliable one, always present, staying up late to mend things around the house, planning surprises for her birthday, and preparing her coffee just the way she preferred it. I believed love meant sacrificing and thought that by working harder, I could bring her happiness. I was mistaken. This realization didn't come amid dramatic clashes or public scenes. Instead, it arrived quietly as an unwavering understanding. I was the one investing, the only one caring, while she seemingly. I saw it outright. I saw in the way she looked at me like I was a piece of old furniture in the house. Useful but unremarkable. I heard it in the way her voice changed when she spoke to others, the laughter and warmth she never used with me. I felt it in the way she turned away at night, like even the weight of my presence was too much for her. But the proof, the undeniable, gut-wrenching proof, came when I stopped trying. For 1 week, I didn't text first. I didn't ask how her day was. I didn't go out of my way to fix things or plan small surprises, and she didn't even notice. She was too busy, too distracted, too engaged in something or someone else. That was the week I started making my plan. Not for revenge, not to make a scene, just to leave, because a man should never have to beg for the bare minimum. The night before I left, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched her scroll through her phone, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. She didn't look up, didn't even sense that something was wrong. I was different. I had a desire to speak up, to inquire one last time if there was anything worth fighting for. But then I realized that if I needed to ask, the answer was already clear. In quiet contemplation, I packed my bags, taking only essentials, leaving behind my wedding ring on the nightstand as I walked out the door. She didn't stir as I departed. Now, with each step away, I finally feel a sense of liberation that had eluded me for years. Strangely, when I left the house, I expected to experience a range of emotions: relief, regret, or perhaps even guilt. However, all that filled me was an unsettling emptiness, as if a part of me had been abandoned in that bedroom that I left while she remained absorbed in her phone. The outside world was silent, seemingly indifferent to the significant change that had just occurred in my life and could never be undone. The cool night air carried the promise of impending rain. My car awaited me exactly where I had left it, mirroring the feeling of stagnation that had gripped my existence while I failed to see it. Sliding into the driver's seat, I tightly grasped the wheel, ready to embark on a new chapter. Wit. Knuckles. I didn't have a destination, only a direction: away from that house, away from the ghost of the man I had been, away from the version of me that had spent too long accepting the bare minimum. I drove for hours, not even paying attention to the road signs, just moving forward 1 mile at a time. The further I got, the lighter my chest felt. No texts, no calls, not even a single missed notification from her. I hadn't expected her to notice immediately. She barely acknowledged me when I was there, so why would she now? But deep down, a small foolish part of me had hoped. Not that she would chase me, not that she would beg me to come back, but that she would at least care enough to realize I was gone. I booked a room at a motel just off the highway, one of those places with flickering neon signs and a lobby that smelled like stale coffee and lost dreams. The man at the front desk barely glanced at me as I handed over my ID, as if he had seen 1,000 men like me before, tired, broken, running. The room mirrored my own lackluster mood, with its beige walls, an outdated television missing half its buttons, and a lumpy bed. I perched on the edge of the bed, gazing at the wall, my untouched bag still resting by my feet. Rather than succumbing to sleep, I remained seated, the burden of my emotions settling deep within me. For so long I had convinced myself of my own happiness, turning a blind eye to the slow deterioration of my spirit. It wasn't just the empty nights or the absence of warmth. It was the realization that I had been nothing more than a mere placeholder in my marriage, unknowingly erasing myself from the narrative. Hours ticked by before I finally lay down, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the distant sound of the highway serving as my only companion. My phone lay dormant on the nightstand, devoid of any calls or notifications from her. The silence spoke volumes, piercing deeper than any words could. As the morning sun filtered through the worn curtains of the low-budget motel, elongated shadows danced across the room. As I lay awake staring at the blank screen across the room, I hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out. My mind replaying moments of my marriage like an old film reel. The quiet, distant way she had spoken to me over the last year. The way her phone became more important than our conversations. The excuses that stacked up like bricks in a wall I didn't even realize was closing me out. I reached for my phone out of habit, but it was just as I had left it. Silent, untouched. No missed calls, no messages, no frantic texts asking where I was, no concern in the middle of the night if she had woken up and found me gone. She hadn't cared enough to reach out. Maybe she thought I was still in the house, somewhere, just another forgotten part of the furniture. I should have expected it. After all, she had been losing interest in me long before I left. But there was something about seeing that blank screen, about the absolute nothingness, that made it real. I pushed myself up from the bed, feeling the stiffness in my back from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. I craved coffee to dispel the ghostly feeling that haunted me, as if I had vanished from my world unnoticed. Grabbing my keys and wallet, I exited the creaking motel door into the morning chill. Across the street, a charming diner beckoned with its history of serving weary travelers and truckers. A bell jingled as I entered, catching the attention of the woman behind the counter, likely in her late 50s. Without a word, she poured me a cup of coffee, acknowledging my need through her actions. As she slid the cup towards me, she remarked, "You look like you need it." I mustered a weary smile, to which she responded with a knowing chuckle, indicating her years of experience in reading people. I hesitated, the confession stuck in my throat, opting instead to take a sip of the bitter brew that momentarily grounded me. "I'm just passing through," I finally managed, evading the raw emotions still too fresh to vocalize. When I finally mentioned it, she gave me a knowing look but didn't push further. Instead, she refilled my cup and left me to my thoughts. I sat there for over an hour, observing the ebb and flow of patrons, pondering whether she had even noticed my absence. Was she anxious, or perhaps relieved? Could it be that she had been anticipating my departure all this time? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I felt compelled to seek answers. Retrieving my phone, I unlocked it and navigated to our messages. The most recent text from her dated back 3 days, a mundane okay devoid of any affection or familiarity, reminiscent of our shared history. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys as I grappled with what to convey. What message would be appropriate? "Hey, did you realize your partner is missing?" No, that sounded feeble. Disheartened, I set my phone aside and opted to peruse social media instead. She rarely divulged personal matters online, but perhaps a clue might surface. Something, anything that could offer insight into her emotional state. Then it caught my eye. A photograph of her beaming in a restaurant, a glass of wine in hand. Seated across from her was another man. Her chair had recently been claimed by the casual presence of his arm, the caption cryptically hinting at a much-needed night out. The timestamp read, "Last night, the same night I had silently exited her life without explanation." To my dismay, she had not even realized my absence. I stared coldly at the photo displayed on my phone, my grip on the device tightening, as if I could obliterate the image in front of me. In the picture, she appeared jubilant, her features soft and aglow under the gentle flicker of candlelight in the restaurant. Her eyes sparkled with vitality, a vibrancy I had not witnessed in her for years. Standing beside her was a man, nonchalantly occupying her space as if it were his own. His relaxed posture conveyed a sense of belonging, as though this scenario was nothing out of the ordinary. I wanted desperately to believe he was just a friend, a colleague, someone she had coincidentally encountered. Yet the apparent intimacy between them, the way she leaned toward him and delicately grasped the stem of her wine glass, revealed all I needed to know. This encounter was not impromptu. This man was not a recent acquaintance. In that moment, it became glaringly evident that he had already usurped my place in her life. I felt a crack deep within me, not the expected rage or heartbreak, but the cold truth that I had been deceiving myself for far too long. She had moved on long before I packed my bags. I signaled the waitress, left money on the counter, and stepped outside into a bright afternoon that felt strangely dim. Questions buzzed in my mind, now all irrelevant. Had she been waiting for me to leave? Had she noticed and didn't care, or was my departure a weight off her shoulders? I stood there unsure of my next move. My plan was to vanish, escape a suffocating marriage turned obligation. But now, holding my phone and facing the undeniable proof of my deception, I realized I had lost myself in her. For years, I dedicated myself to ensuring her happiness, contorting myself to fit the mold of the man she desired, molding my identity to suit her every whim and fancy. I meticulously crafted our vacations around her preferences, rearranged my daily routine to align with hers, and even distanced myself from friendships she deemed inconvenient. Slowly but surely, I diminished, convincing myself that love meant sacrificing parts of myself for the greater good of the relationship. I wholeheartedly believed that with enough patience and effort, she would eventually recognize me once more. However, that moment never came. I had practically vanished from her world long before I physically departed. Feeling adrift in my own thoughts, I instinctively reached out to an old friend I hadn't connected with in a while. Vincent. Back in college, we shared an unbreakable bond, the kind where months could pass without communication, yet the instant we spoke again, it felt like no time had lapsed. Vincent was the voice of reason who used to caution me, "You're giving too much, man. Love shouldn't deplete you." I hesitated, hovering over his name, debating whether I even had the right to call after so long. But before I could talk myself out of it, I hit dial. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Well, look who finally remembered I exist. Despite everything, I almost smiled. "Hey Vince," there was a pause, and then, "Something's wrong. I can hear it." I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. Another pause. "You mean left?" "Yeah," he let out a low whistle. "Where are you?" "Middle of nowhere, honestly." I glanced around the mostly empty parking lot. "Some rundown motel off the highway." "Didn't really plan this far ahead." He didn't hesitate. "Come to Chicago. You need a place to crash." I stopped the automatic response of "I'm fine" dying before it could form. I wasn't fine. I was lost, untethered, floating in a space where everything I thought was real had crumbled beneath me. "Yeah," I said finally. "That'd be good. Then get here and don't disappear halfway through the drive, or I'll personally hunt you down." I let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh, yeah, as I ended the call, and slid my phone back into my pocket. Something in my chest loosened just a little. I didn't know what awaited me in Chicago, but at least it was forward motion. At least it wasn't standing still in the wreckage of a life that had never really been mine to begin with. I got in my car, turned the key, and pulled onto the highway. I didn't look back. The miles rolled by in a blur of asphalt and highway signs, each one carrying me further from the life I had walked away from. The deeper I got into this drive, the more I realized just how little of myself I had left. It wasn't just about leaving my wife. It was about the fact that I had spent years bending into a shape that fit her world, never stopping to ask if I still fit into my own. The silence in the car was suffocating. I used to love driving alone, cranking up the music, feeling the road beneath me. But now every second felt like an invitation for my thoughts to creep back in. I attempted to drown out the noise in my head by turning on the radio, but even the music felt overwhelming. It seemed like a distraction from the reality that I was now just a man with no destination. I stopped at a shabby gas station on the outskirts of a remote town, where the pumps appeared older than me and the cashier hardly glanced up from his phone as I entered. I picked up a bottle of water and a pack of gum, then stood at the counter contemplating whether to check my phone. Despite telling myself not to, a part of me filled with self-pity wanted to see if she had reached out. My fingers acted on their own as I unlocked my phone and stared at the screen. Nothing. There were no missed calls, texts, or desperate messages asking about my whereabouts. I chuckled quietly, shaking my head in resignation. Of course, there was no communication. I settled the bill and returned to the car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as I resumed my journey. The road should have symbolized freedom, a chance for a fresh start to rebuild. Yet as I drove, all I felt was the burden of what I had lost, or perhaps what I never truly had. By the time I reached the outskirts of Chicago, the sun had set, casting the city in a glow of streetlights and neon signs. It had been years since I had been here. Not since college, not since I prioritized someone else's happiness over my own. As I pulled up to Vincent's place, an aged brick building with a weathered fire escape, I could barely step out of the car before he appeared. The same confident smirk, the same self-assured demeanor. He was the kind of man who remained steadfast in his identity despite life's obstacles. "Look who finally showed up," he remarked, leaning against the doorframe with crossed arms. I exhaled a mixture of tension and familiarity. "Hey, Vince," I greeted him as he scrutinized me before stepping aside. He poured from a nearby fridge. "Can we talk about why you left? Or should I guess?" My feet carried me into the room, dumping my bag by the entrance. The environment matched my expectations. Chaotic yet homely, where imperfections coexisted with a sense of order. He handed me a beer and slumped onto the sofa. She didn't even notice Vince. I left and she didn't even acknowledge it. He responded with a low whistle. "That's tough, man," I muttered, gazing at my drink. The worst part, I thought she would. I hoped she'd at least reach out. But nothing. Vince observed me intently, his thoughts unreadable. "If she had called and pleaded for you to return, would you have?" That question hit me like a blow to the chest. My initial urge was to deny it, to affirm my departure as final. I wasn't weak, just honest. I spent years hoping she'd choose me again. "I don't even know if I can stop," Vince admitted, running a hand through his hair. "That's why you needed to leave," he remarked, his words sinking in heavily. I had fought for something not worth saving. Now in this unfamiliar place, drinking beer in someone else's home, I realized something worse. I didn't know who I was without her, and that frightened me the most. The first night in Chicago was sleepless. I lay on Vincent's couch, gazing at the ceiling, hearing the distant traffic sounds. The city thrived unlike my old life, vibrant and busy beyond the walls that once confined me. But despite the change, the heavy feeling persisted in my chest. I had left, but the past lingered on. My phone lay in my hand, hesitant. It had been more than 24 hours since I walked away, yet she hadn't reached out. Perhaps she never would. Maybe my absence was simply seen as an empty seat at the dinner table, easily replaced by someone else. The sight of her with that man at the restaurant continued to haunt me. I had spent years convincing myself that our love still lingered beneath her distant facade, if only I could reach it. But that photograph shattered my illusions. She wasn't yearning for me. She had already found a replacement. Frustrated, I placed my phone on the table and closed my eyes, breathing through the pain in my chest. The next morning, Vincent was already awake, casually frying eggs in the kitchen. He didn't pry for details or ask questions he knew I wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he handed me a plate and gestured towards the small balcony outside his apartment. "Eat," he simply said, "then we'll talk." I didn't engage in an argument during the meal. The food lacked flavor, yet I managed to eat it, realizing the importance of grounding myself before falling too deeply into my thoughts. After we finished, he picked up his keys and gestured for me to come along. "Where are we headed?" I inquired, breaking my silence. "I'm taking you to remember what it means to truly live," he replied. Despite not being in the mood for enigmatic advice, I followed him. Eventually, we arrived at a small boxing gym nestled inside an old brick building, a place permeated with the scent of sweat and aged leather. As we entered, the sounds of punching bags and heavy breathing enveloped us. Turning to me, Vince stated, "You need to release some pent-up energy." My eyebrow quirked in confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked. He smirked and explained, "No offense, but you seem like someone who has buried their feelings for too long, and that's not healthy. You need a way to let it out, which is why you're going to hit the bags, until you lose that defeated look." I wanted to protest, to claim that I didn't require this outlet. However, deep down I realized that maybe Vince handed me a pair of gloves, and in no time I found myself in front of a heavy bag, fists clenched, body unsure. "Just hit it," he said casually, leaning against the ropes of the closest ring. "It doesn't have to be pretty, just let it out." I hesitated. I was no fighter, never the type to find solace in hitting things. But there was something about the weight of the bag that compelled me to give it a try. And so I did. The first punch landed weakly, barely making the sound against the leather. The second was stronger, and by the third something within me snapped. I wasn't concerned with form or technique. I was consumed by memories of years spent shrinking myself for someone who never truly saw me. The nights waiting up for her as she worked late. The times I held back as she dismissed me as insignificant. Her effortless moving on while I struggled to piece together a life that had never truly been mine. I repeatedly struck the punching bag, my arms aching, breath ragged, and sweat soaking my back. Yet amidst the physical strain, I sensed a glimmer of emotion other than emptiness. Vince, a friend, patted my shoulder. "Feeling better?" I wiped my face with my glove, breathing heavily. "Yeah," I confessed. "Yeah, I think so." He smiled. Good, let's grab some real food. You look like you haven't eaten in days. Leaving the gym with a lighter feeling in my chest, I followed him. Although still lost and uncertain about my identity post-breakup, I was beginning to unravel the layers I had buried within myself. The boxing gym marked just the initial stage of this journey. That evening, Vincent took me to a bar in the city's north side. A cozy place with dim lighting, a pool table, and a crowd uninterested in pasts, focused only on present interactions. I wasn't much in the mood for drinking, but Vince insisted. You need to be around people, he said, slapping a beer into my hand, not the kind who make you feel like a damn ghost. He wasn't wrong. For years, I had spent my time orbiting around one person, adjusting my entire life to match hers, making sure I was convenient, easy, unobtrusive. I had let friendships fade, had stopped going out, had made my world so small that by the time she was done with me, I barely existed outside of her shadow. And now, here I was, a man untethered, sitting in a bar that smelled like old whiskey and good stories, listening to the hum of strangers talking about lives I had no part in. Vince leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip of his drink before giving me a side glance. So tell me, what's the plan? I frowned. Plan? He smirked. Yeah, the whole not being a pathetic shell of a dude who spent years being a doormat thing. You got a next step? I let out a breath, rubbing my thumb against the condensation on my glass. To be honest, I'm completely lost. Leaving my wife, my home, and the life I had built for over a decade, I have no idea what's next. Vince looked at me intently before shaking his head. You have to stop fixating on her, he advised. I scoffed, finding it easier said than done. No, seriously, he continued, placing his drink down with a soft thud. You're still letting her define everything. But what about you? What do you really want? I started to reply but ended up staying silent. Vince chuckled, realizing the issue. That right there is the problem. You've been so focused on being who she needed that you forgot about being true to yourself. Before I could react, a buzzing from my phone interrupted. My stomach clenched involuntarily. It was probably just some spam email or notification I didn't care about. Yet a part of me. Until I saw the name on the screen, my breath caught in my throat. It was her. After days of silence, walking out and seeing her happily in a photo with another man, I had convinced myself she hadn't even noticed my absence. My hands tightened around the phone, my mind urging me not to pick up, but my heart was still coming to terms with the fact that I had meant so little to the woman I had given everything to. Vince immediately picked up on the change in my expression. Leaning in closer, he spoke in a low but determined voice, "Don't you dare." I hesitated, my thumb lingering over the screen. The phone rang again, then fell silent. No voicemail, no follow-up text, just silence. Strangely, that silence hurt more than any words she could have said. Vince shaking his head sighed, "Man, if you even think about calling her back." I won't, I cut in, my voice softer than expected. And for the first time I realized. She dialed, but it was. She probably missed me, not because she realized she had made a mistake, but simply out of curiosity. Perhaps sitting next to another man triggered a fleeting thought about why I had stopped chasing her. I placed my phone down and turned to Vince, raising my glass as I asked, "So what should I do now?" Vince's face lit up with a slow grin. "Now we begin unraveling who you truly are," he replied. For the first time in a while, a spark of hope ignited within me. The following morning, I woke up feeling different, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't a groundbreaking moment, but rather a subtle release akin to a song fading out after playing for too long. It was the first time in years that I wasn't consumed by thoughts of her upon waking up. As I eased my sore muscles from yesterday's boxing session, I gazed up at the ceiling with a newfound sense of peace. Vince's apartment was a place filled with uncertainty for me. I couldn't decide how long I intended to stay there. A week, a month, maybe even forever. The idea of permanence was daunting, as for the first time in my adult life, I had only myself to consider. Vince was already in the kitchen preparing coffee and scrolling through his phone. He barely glanced up as I entered. "You look like you actually got some sleep," he remarked. I nodded, running a hand over my face. "I think I did," I replied. He smirked knowingly. "It's amazing what happens when you let go of dead weight." I rolled my eyes, acknowledging his point without argument. We sat in comfortable silence, savoring our coffee. Despite the lack of a job prospect, a solid plan, or clarity about what came next, I should have felt anxious. Yet for the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It thrilled me. My phone vibrated on the table, and I hesitated before picking it up. A text from her. "Where are you?" Just 3 simple words devoid of emotion or urgency, like a casual inquiry about my whereabouts. I stared at the screen for a prolonged moment. I chose to be silent, not out of a lack of words, but out of a newfound realization that words were unnecessary. Placing my phone face down, I felt a sense of inner peace knowing that I didn't need to be found. Sipping my coffee, I reclined in my chair and smiled, feeling liberated after years of feeling captive.